Welcome to Am I Famous Yet? Memoir of a Working Class Rock Star. This is chapter 28 called Weddings, Funerals, and Bar Mitzvahs. I have a long-standing joke that I tell when asked what gigs I'm playing lately. I say weddings, funerals, and bar mitzvahs. It makes people smirk or occasionally giggle. Then there is a certain kind of literalist who asks, funerals? Yes, funerals. There's an old tradition of New Orleans brass bands playing funerals. The jazz funeral is often the highest honor that a New Orleans musician can receive while being accompanied to their final above-ground burial. In fact, the second line, which is an entire genre of music and its own unique rhythmic style, comes from the New Orleans brass band funeral tradition. The march to the cemetery consists of somber dirges, but the walk back from the cemetery, or the part of the procession after passing the slave owner's house, depending upon which version of the tradition story you've heard, broke out into joyous parade music with dancing and shouting. To this day, the New Orleans funeral tradition involves jubilation. When my mother passed in 2001, I remember my New York friends sending their condolences, but I also remember my New Orleans friends, specifically singer Frankie Ford and his manager, saying to me, "Celebrate." Death is a part of life. It's a part of the deal we make by being here on this planet. I find the New Orleanian method of processing grief to be the healthiest that I've thus far encountered. While I certainly have played many wakes and memorial jam sessions for our fallen comrades in music, that's not the specific intent of the weddings, funerals, and bar mitzvahs joke. In actual fact, I'm referring to the reality that I'm playing with private party bands that do mostly weddings, but also other functions where someone might want to hire musicians. Many of us do these gigs in between our rock star sightings and world tours because they pay well. They also keep an instrument in our hands and keep our fingers nimble. In and around New York City, these gigs are called club dates. I'm not sure exactly why. They usually occur in catering halls and not nightclubs. They often occur in golf and country clubs, but not exclusively enough to require that every private party gig be called a club date. This is a regional quirk, it turns out. In the Boston area, these same gigs are called general business or GB bands. In Nashville, they're called formal gigs. In LA, the same gigs are called casuals. In London, they're called function bands. It's confusing, but all of these words signify the exact same type of gig. I know one drummer in New York who refers to any private party as a corporate gig, regardless of whether a company or an individual has hired the band. Even though that nomenclature doesn't quite fit, everyone knows exactly what he means by it. There is an actual corporate type of gig we typically call industrials. These can be some of the highest paying gigs ever. I got about $1,000 once to play for 8 minutes at 8 in the morning for the opening of a rah-rah sales meeting for a big telecom company. We had to synchronize an intricate medley to a video presentation in the days before ubiquitous click tracks. This was concurrent with a lot of literal pyrotechnics, fire shooting from everywhere, and acrobats on stilts. It would have been a giant payday if not for the 12 hours of rehearsal they also booked for it. The tech call that morning was for something like 5 a.m., so I guess if you break that down hourly, it wasn't such a huge payday after all. We played a corporate gig once with Reeves and the Vandellas in Baltimore on the occasion of the Corrections Corporation of America National Convention. That's right. We entertained a hotel ballroom full of for-profit prison owners. Other than the name over the door, the folks inside were just about like any other convention audience. There were 750 people in a ballroom eating rubber chicken and waiting for the speeches to end so they could dance in the streets, as it were. It was fairly unremarkable other than a souvenir handbill for the evening, which I did take home with me. Beautiful downtown Baltimore is a rough town. You may have heard other people mention this fact. The morning after that gig, we were waiting in front of the hotel for an airport pickup. Our luggage was stacked against the wall of the building, which included all of Martha's sheet music, the gowns, the makeup, everything. Oh, and my bass. There was a dude just kind of leaning against the wall by the building a few yards from us. There was nothing notable about that. A few minutes went by. I noticed that he was a couple of feet closer to the luggage and, my bass, than he was moments ago. Now my New York City street sense started to kick in. So I was keeping a nonchalant eye on him. Another minute later, he was another couple of feet closer, just hanging out, watching traffic go by. By this time, he and I were about equidistant to the luggage. No longer satisfied with our sense of security, I now pretended to walk over and pull something out of my bass bag. In my fake efforts to dislodge whatever I was pretending to retrieve, I was of course forced to pick up and move the bass back within range, so I had my hand on it. I was also now positioned closer to the luggage so that he could no longer have the jump on me should he decide to grab something and make a run for it. Within a couple of minutes, the dude suddenly decided he wasn't interested in hanging out in front of the hotel anymore and casually walked off. Miss Lois Reeves, a Vandella, witnessed this entire interaction. She nodded at me and said, "Smart. Miss Lois is from Detroit. She knows about street sense." I just thought that it would have been really ironic to have had our luggage or my bass stolen in front of a hotel filled with corrections officers. Several years before this, I was also in Baltimore for another corporate gig with the Shirelles at the convention center. It was another huge decorated ballroom for 1,000 or more people that was hosting the dinner at the end of a national convention. There were vendor booths on the convention floor, seminars in the meeting rooms, the whole shebang. The ballroom was also outfitted with a big stage, lighting, and huge video screens to project the 4-camera TV rig for the people in the back of the room to see close-ups like at a Bon Jovi concert. Only instead of Bon Jovi, it was the Shirelles and the Drifters. It's a different demographic, but the show business production trappings are the same. This was the NFDA annual convention and dinner. We were there for several hours loading in and sound checking before we realized what NFDA stood for. The National Funeral Directors Association. We were playing for 1,000 morticians. Suddenly, all of the gentlemen walking around with red satin shirts and ties at the sales booths and the sales booths with embalming supplies started to make sense. I'll say this about funeral directors. Those cats need to let off some steam. When they're away from their customers, them dudes know how to party. I can't remember a wilder or more raucous crowd at any gig. They were hooting, hollering, screaming, dancing, and practically bouncing off the walls and swinging from the chandeliers. Those folks cut loose. It was a blast. Afterwards, we walked out with a souvenir videotape of the 4-camera shoot of the gig. It's some of the best footage I've ever seen in a genuinely fun but strange gig. There was a mega-church gig with Martha Reeves and the Vandellas in Wichita, Kansas once that had a similar multi-camera setup. Their media rig was, of course, designed to broadcast their weekly church services to the masses, so it was a pretty sophisticated rig. Likewise, we walked out of that gig with a freshly burned DVD of the evening's performance. The Funeral Directors Convention wasn't the only time we played for morticians with the Shirelles either. We played a catering hall in New Jersey with lots of mirrors, marble, and chandeliers. This time it was a birthday party for a successful local businesswoman who owned a funeral parlor. It was a dinner for 250 of her closest friends, featuring a classic soul music performance at the end of the evening. It is standard practice for Master of Ceremonies to introduce the guest of honor at events like these as they make their official entrance into the room. This is true of weddings, bar mitzvahs, and even occasional birthday parties. This is accomplished through a PA system at crushing volume, usually accompanied by lots of flashing lights and very loud disco music. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our hostess and tonight's guest of honor. Give it up for Miss Madonna. This was the mortician's actual name, not the singer of a similar moniker. Now, my memory of this evening is cloudy. I don't think there was an actual casket in the room, and I don't think she was wheeled into the room in the casket only to emerge from it upon her introduction for dramatic effect. I don't think that happened, but it might have. I know that we band folk certainly laughed about that entrance, so we might have invented or embellished it, but we certainly played a gig for Madonna, her funeral home employees, family, and friends. Perhaps we conflated Madonna's entrance with Screamin' Jay Hawkins' standard stage entrance. I never played with Screamin' Jay, but several friends of mine have. I got to see him perform once, though, which was amazing. This particular story came to me from drummer Crusher Green, though I regret not personally witnessing this. Crusher said that when the curtain went up, the band was on stage playing Screamin' Jay's overture. Also noticeably center stage was a black coffin. The gag was that they had preloaded Jay into the coffin with the microphone. As the curtain went up, the front of house sound man turned on the mic. Screamin' Jay started doing his thing inside the coffin and popped out, making his entrance during the opening number. It's just good old macabre show business comedy. The particular night Crusher was describing was a 2-show night. I don't care who you are, that second show was always harder than the first. Screamin' Jay was in his later years at the time of this incident, but I have had similar things happen to me at much younger ages. The announcer crowed, "Ladies and gentlemen, Screamin' Jay Hawkins." The band started the overture, the lights came up, the curtain went up, the sound man turned on the mic, the entire audience was assaulted by 10,000 watts of an amplified Screamin' Jay snoring. He was out cold. The piano player had to go bang on the coffin lid to wake him up to do the show. Don't let anybody tell you show business is easy. We played a Greek-American wedding once at a swanky hotel on the coast, up in Connecticut. We were requested to play some Greek traditional tunes at the reception. The band leader had found some generic Greek folk tune sheet music online. The melodies were written in traditional notation, no problem, but the chord symbols were written in the Greek alphabet. Problem. I ended up combining my two collegiate experiences into one suddenly and uniquely useful skill. I knew from Tulane about the Greek fraternities and knew what all the letters over the doors of the frat houses were. Additionally, I knew from a combination of my studies at Berkeley about solfege, the do, re, mi syllables. From my world travels, I also knew that a lot of European music uses a fixed do system. This means that the syllable do always corresponds to the note C on the piano, whereas in America we use a movable do system. Do can be the tonic of any key here. From this, I deduced that a chord symbol using the Greek letters sigma, omega, and lambda spelled out the word sol, which is the fifth note of the scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol. So if do is C, then sol is G. Yes, I know. The band looked at me with the same facial expression that you have right now. Suffice to say, I was able to scribble in chord symbols in English Latin alphabet characters that was familiar to the band. As a result, we were able to start playing our sad approximations of Greek folk music. As the Greeks do in traditional celebrations, someone smashed a plate on the dance floor and hollered, "Oppa!" I took this as a sign we were doing a good job. The hotel detective, however, let's call him the house dick, was not amused. In general, rich white people in Connecticut do not take kindly to uncivilized destruction of private property. Knowing this, the house dick immediately turned up the lowered party lights to their full brilliance, stopped the band, brought everything to a screeching halt, and called the cops. The wedding was ruined. The bride was inconsolable in buckets of tears. It was not going well. It took several phone calls to find an actual hotel manager, since this was late on a Saturday night. They had all gone home for the weekend, leaving only the dick in charge of the property. After about a half an hour of just standing around in silence with bright lights on, while conferences were being had in the hallway with the family, the cops, the hotel dick, and the eventually located hotel manager, the party was finally allowed to continue for the last 15 minutes of our booking. Somehow lost in translation from Greece to suburban Connecticut was the fact that the celebrants had every intention of paying for all of the smashed stoneware. This is a standard cost of a Greek wedding, like the floral centerpieces for each table or at every other wedding. The dick had apparently missed that day at cultural awareness school. As such, this family ended up saving a bundle of cash because they only got to smash one plate. As the party resumed, they rushed immediately into the cake cutting ceremony because they were now way behind schedule. The groom tried to make light of the ridiculous situation by doing the smash the wedding cake in the bride's face comedy shtick. I've seen this work many times at other weddings when it was a mutual joke. This particular day, it wasn't, since the bride had already seen her magical night ruined. It only generated more creamily frosted tears. We played 3 more songs, got paid, and went home. And then there was the Hannibal Lecter wedding. Well, that's what we came to call it. It was an odd affair, to be sure. We got called to provide an acoustic trio for a wedding gig, which is a bit unusual to start with. It's not common to have a raucous dance party with only an acoustic guitar, acoustic bass, and drums played with brushes. I suppose it's possible, but it's unlikely. The venue was familiar to us. It was a 150-year-old Gothic-style converted synagogue on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It's a beautifully decrepit building, very ornate, spooky, and creaky. Depending on the lighting and the spirit of the gathering, it can range easily from joyous to downright creepy. This gig was more in the creepy category, although it wasn't immediately apparent why. When we arrived, the venue was beautifully lit with colored feature lights scattered throughout the building, making the porticos more dramatic and elegant. In the center of the floor, they had even constructed a platform that was surrounded by a water tank, forming a moat around it. In the center was a beautiful bride's table set for two. There were actual trees brought in to hang over the table, and one of the more elaborate florist's constructions I've ever seen. The place was decked out to the nines. It was gorgeous and clearly very expensive, well into six figures for the evening for sure. This synagogue could hold probably 300 to 400 people seated, and maybe 750 to 1,000 if it was set up for standing room and using the balconies. But not this night. This night, the list of attendees included exactly two people, the bride and the groom. That's it. No guests. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. There were plenty of staff on site. There were caterers in the basement whipping up a 5-course gourmet meal. There was a wedding officiant, a photographer, a videographer, wait staff, all of the trappings of a normal wedding ceremony and reception. There were just no guests. It's the only time I can remember at any wedding gig that the size of the band outnumbered the audience, and we were just a trio. To say that the energy in the room was awkward is an understatement. We just played quietly in the corner all night, including the first dance and all of that. People would come in and out of the room as necessary to perform the wedding ceremony, help with the cake cutting, or serve the meal. The only thing they didn't do was the bouquet toss, because there was no one there to catch it, so there was no point really. At one point, the groom left the room to use the bathroom. We were playing Fly Me to the Moon at the time. Suddenly the bride spoke directly to us saying, "That's a song from our favorite anime cartoon." Oh shit, what were we supposed to do? She spoke directly to us. Do we answer her? Do we make eye contact? Anime? Do we just let that comment go by unremarked? That wasn't even nearly the oddest thing about the whole setup. "Oh yeah, great," we said. That was all we said. That was the end of our interactions with the couple for the evening, except for a thanks at the end. Her speaking to us as if we were normal human beings in a normal situation only served to amplify the creepiness of the whole thing. I'm not sure why we decided to call it the Hannibal Lecter wedding, other than the fact that none of us would have been surprised in the least to read in the paper the next morning that the bride's liver had been eaten by her new husband. Nothing of the sort happened, of course, that we're aware of.